In this video we're going to have a look at a notebook file that I've already created that I used during my first placement to teach mixed fractions, as you can see. And I'm going to show you some of the features I used in this notebook file and how we can create them. So you can see immediately there's a lot of different things on this notebook file now. I've changed the background of the file, that's this piece that you can see around the edge. I've then placed a large rectangle with a grey edge and a slightly off-white colour on top of that to create a border style effect. I've put my keywords in another rectangle that's layered on top. Now these things don't start moving around as I click on them. I've got text on top of that. I've got a different font for my title. I've got a rectangle here that represents one whole one, and this line that you may be able to see in the middle or may not is definitely not visible when displayed on a board, but if I click on that line you can see it fade into view. So that's a kind of animation like you might use in PowerPoint. So the way that those different things are set up, if I click on this background rectangle, you see the padlock symbol appear all the way up here at the corner of the rectangle. This is using locking. So if I unlock that shape, it will now move around like any other rectangle. And I'm just going to undo that and put it back where it started. So with any shape, if I click on it and click on the drop down menu, I can lock a shape in place, and that stops it from being an object that can move around. It makes it into a fixed object. It's good for stopping you accidentally moving it around while you're setting your file up or during your lesson, and it's also good for stopping pupils moving things around, as we'll see to good effect on another slide. The same has been set up with this purple rectangle. Again, you can see that this one's locked to stop it moving, and the text is just placed on top. Now, one thing that you need to be careful of when you're putting things on top of each other is if I unlock this shape, we can change the order of our shapes. If I go down to the order, we can think of our notebook file as having three layers: a background, a middle ground, and a foreground. Any object can be in one of those three layers. So if I send this rectangle to the back, you'll see it now goes light grey. It wouldn't be visible because it's now behind that other shape. So I'm going to bring it forwards to make sure it's visible and lock it back in place so I can't accidentally move it. So using ordering allows us to control which shapes appear to be on top of other shapes. The font that we've used here we can control through the font option, and the other thing on this slide was this line that appeared. So if I select this line, which once you've set it up like this, the only way you can do is by dragging to select it, under the Properties tab over here we have something for object animation that I've got set to fade in, and we can control those settings even more. So we can use that to have any object into something that appears when we click on it. So we can do the same thing for this whole rectangle. Under the Properties tab, if I go to Object Animation and type it to fade in, it shows me a quick preview, but then if I click on it, it will fade in. And we get some other animations in there. If I just select it again, we could change our object animations to all sorts of different things, as we can see. We can also use this Properties menu to change things like the fill. We can put gradient fills in there. So this kind of opens up more things that the basic menu at the bottom doesn't give us. The other interesting effect in this notebook file, if we go back to page view and have a look at this slide, this has been set up to use the activity builder that I showed you in the add-ons menu before. The way this works, this is an activity that asks pupils to find fractions equivalent to a whole one, two whole ones, or three whole ones. So if I take the fraction 5/6 and drag it onto the circle that says 1, it jumped back to where it started because it's not equivalent to 1. But if I take the fraction 15/15, which is equivalent to 1, and drop it on, it will stay in place because it is equivalent to 1. So we can sort the fractions onto the various circles, and I asked my pupils to come out and take it in turns to drag these into place. Some of them obviously don't go into any of the circles. The circles themselves and the labels in the middle don't move, but the title does, and you can see we've changed the colour of the background again here. So how do we create something like this? Well, first of all of these fractions that we're dragging around have been created as single objects. That's using what's called grouping. If I click ungroup, you can see that this fraction is made up of three separate things, two numbers and a line, created with the line tool in the middle. If you then select those different objects and click the drop down menu, you can group the items together and that forms them into a single object. If we now go to the activity builder menu, we can choose an object, in this case it's the locked circle 1, and edit its properties, and we can see that it's set up to accept different fractions. So they were created by dragging a fraction into the menu, and all remaining objects were added to the list of objects that it rejects. We can then change the settings of what accepts and rejects means. So when accepted, objects do nothing, that was how they stayed in place, but when rejected they bounce back to where they started from. So that's how that setting was created. So I set up my circle object and I turned it into an activity builder object. Activity builder lets you create some really interesting activities to do with matching items together, and it can be used in lots of different ways. The other slides on this one were more basic, but there are still some shapes that fade into view. So you could see these were used to allow pupils to read the slide but not necessarily see everything I wanted them to have by the end of the slide at the start. There is another way to create an effect like this, and that's using the screen shade function, which is this one down here in the menu bar. If I click on that, I get a grey rectangle that covers up my entire screen that I can then drag down during my lesson to sequentially reveal parts of my slide as I want them. That would create the same effect as having things fade into view, but controlling the entire slide rather than just the individual objects that you can see I've got set to fade in place. Now I've actually used that same kind of screen shade to create a pairs game on this slide, this notebook page, where as I click the different squares it reveals matching pictures. These are for finding equivalent fractions. Oh, that was a lucky guess. And I toggled these to control which objects were visible. That effect was created, if I just add in a new page, by putting in a table. We can put in a table by clicking this table button and selecting, say, a 3x3 table. I then inserted my different objects into the different cells by clicking Insert Picture File from the menu at the top, and then using the drop down menu of a cell we can put in a cell shade that then responds as you saw in the previous activity. The final thing I want to mention in this video is, if I just change to my first slide, is how we can display this to the class without necessarily having all the extra stuff around the edge of the screen by clicking on this View Screens option and changing to a full screen display. You can see we then get our slides filling the entire screen, still with the arrows to let us control what we can see, and this will still respond in the same way as it would have before, but it now doesn't have all those extra controls cluttering the screen, and a click of that screens button takes you back to the starting display. You can also use this menu to display two pages side by side, which can be really helpful if you've got, for instance, an example as well as a list of questions that you want your class to have a look at.